Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller and today I'll be your companion on a gentle journey into sleep. Before we begin, take a deep breath, relax, and don't forget to support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Now lie back, close your eyes, and let this story guide you into a mysterious world filled with wonders, accompanied by the soft patter of rain in the background. After all the strange encounters and journeys with lost souls, I thought I was ready to face anything. But each time I thought that, I realized there was still so much I didn't understand about the dark world beyond. So when I checked into an old hotel in a small town, I had no idea I was about to walk into another story. A story I would never be able to forget. That evening, after a long, exhausting day, all I wanted was a place to rest and clear my mind. This hotel wasn't large, but it had a vintage charm with decor reminiscent of the 1960s. The walls were covered in dark red wallpaper, paintings hung slightly askew, and a rusted brass chandelier swayed gently from the high ceiling. At check-in, the receptionist told me my room was on the third floor, at the end of the hall, room 304. When I entered, I noticed it was spacious, with a double bed, an old armchair, and a large mirror by the vanity opposite the bed. Everything in this room felt aged, from the furniture to the worn carpet underfoot. I placed my bags down, turned on the bedside lamp, and sat on the bed, sighing as fatigue washed over me. But as I glanced at the mirror, I froze. For a brief moment, I saw the reflection of a man standing behind me. He had short hair, a tall, thin build, and was dressed in a dark suit. The most terrifying detail, however, was his eyes. Dark, hollow, and void of any light. I turned around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just silence, with the soft hum of the ceiling fan spinning above. Convincing myself it was just an illusion brought on by exhaustion, I tried to calm down, thinking maybe I had imagined it. But as soon as I looked back at the mirror, the man reappeared. This time he was closer, as if he was moving toward me. A cold sweat trickled down my spine as I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and then opened them again. This time, the mirror was empty, no trace of him. Trying to ignore the disturbing vision, I decided to take a shower to relax. But as soon as I stepped into the bathroom, my eyes instinctively glanced at the large mirror over the sink. And just then, the man's figure appeared again, standing silently behind me. Now I could see his face more clearly, pale skin, sunken eyes, and lips that looked lifeless. He stood motionless, his gaze fixed on me through the mirror, as if he were trying to convey something. I screamed and spun around, but the bathroom was completely empty. His figure had vanished, leaving me trembling in front of the mirror, feeling like my heart was about to burst from fear. I returned to the room, breathing heavily, trying to regain my composure. Something was very wrong with this room, and I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I started packing my things, getting ready to leave, but as I reached for the door, I heard a faint whisper coming from the mirror. "Don't leave. Help me." The man's voice was cold, filled with despair. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to run far away, but another part felt responsible, like I was meant to help this trapped soul. I turned back to the mirror, and this time the man was no longer standing behind me. He was in the mirror itself, his face etched with exhaustion and sorrow. He looked at me with pleading eyes, his pale lips moving as though he wanted to say more. "Find her. Help me find her." His voice was like a painful, desperate plea. I didn't fully understand his words, but I could feel the agony and despair in his gaze. Suddenly, I felt myself being pulled into his story, as though I couldn't refuse. Taking a deep breath, I decided to ask, unsure if he could hear me. "Who is she? Who am I supposed to find?" The man looked at me for a moment, and his hollow eyes seemed to glimmer with a spark of hope. He spoke softly. "She's the woman I loved, the one I lost because of my mistakes. I've been here too long, waiting for a chance to say I'm sorry." And with that, his image gradually faded from the mirror, leaving me alone with my rapid breaths and a chilling sense of dread. That night I couldn't sleep, haunted by the image of the man in the mirror, his story replaying over and over in my mind. The next morning I left the hotel, carrying his unfinished story and a newfound resolve. I would dig into the history of this hotel to see if there was a story of lost love that he had left behind, and whether I was afraid or not, I knew I would return to that hotel, because I had made a promise, and because his soul was still waiting for release. After leaving the hotel with a promise to help the spirit in the mirror, I realized that I had stepped further into the world of lost souls. This journey seemed to lead me to places filled with forgotten memories and hidden pain. But instead of fear, I felt drawn in, eager to understand what lay behind the darkness. That's why, on a rainy evening, I decided to stop at an abandoned playground on the outskirts of the city. This playground had once been a place of joy for many children, with swings, slides, and ring toss games. But time and neglect had left it covered in the dust of memories and decay. Rusted swings creaked in the wind, the chipped paint on the ladders, and the rotting play structures gave the place an eerie, silent gloom. The distant streetlights cast a faint glow over the playground, just enough for me to see the darkness covering everything. As I stepped into the playground, a cold feeling washed over me. The rain fell softly, making the air damp and melancholic. I looked around. There was no one else here, just me standing in the empty playground. Suddenly, a light, muffled giggle echoed from afar, from a dark corner of the playground. The laughter was faint, like a whisper from a child, resonating in the silence. I startled, turning my head toward the sound, but saw nothing but rusty equipment and shadows. I thought I might be imagining things, but as I moved closer to the old swings, the laughter echoed again, this time closer. It was soft, playful, as if someone was teasing me. "Come play with us." The whisper floated through the air, gentle but haunting. A shiver ran down my spine, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer to the swing, and as soon as I touched the rusted chain, it began to sway lightly as if someone had just sat down. The rain continued to fall, and the creaking of the swing mixed with the rain to create a strange, sad melody. In that moment, I imagined seeing the shadowy figure of a child on the swing, swaying slowly in the dark. I called out, my voice shaky in the quiet, "Is someone here?" There was no response, but the laughter continued, circling around me, pulling me into an invisible game. I took a step back, feeling the chill of fear creep up my spine. The entire area felt wrapped in darkness, and each gust of wind carried the sound of laughter and whispers from ghostly children. Then I heard soft footsteps running on the wet ground, light but clear, as if children were running around me. The footsteps came from all directions, and a small, sad voice said, "Play with us. Don't leave us behind." My heart tightened with an indescribable sadness. I couldn't see any figures, but I knew these small spirits were still here, trapped in this playground, unable to find peace. Perhaps these children had once played here, until a tragic accident or terrible event had left them stuck, their spirits bound to this decaying playground. "What can I do to help you?" I asked, my heart heavy. There was a moment of silence, and then a soft, childlike voice spoke, filled with sadness. "Remember us. Don't forget that we once played here." The voice was faint, but filled with hope, as if all these spirits needed was acknowledgement, a memory of their existence. I stood still, absorbing the sorrow that permeated this quiet space, and promised that I would never forget the little souls abandoned in this playground. As I left, the rain continued to fall, light and cold. I turned back to look, seeing the swing still swaying in the breeze as if the children were still playing, forever preserved in the memory of the past. And from then on, whenever I hear a child's laughter or see a swing swaying in the wind, I remember that abandoned playground. Those innocent souls remain there, forever bound to the playground of memories, waiting for someone to remember they once existed. I continued my journey to a renowned restaurant on the outskirts of the city. This place was famous not only for its exquisite cuisine, but also for its classic architecture from the previous century and the mysterious stories surrounding it. It was said that the restaurant had a basement deep underground, a place that very few were permitted to enter. Those who had been there, whether fortunate or unfortunate enough, reported strange experiences and an eerie feeling that they never wanted to face again. I arrived at the restaurant on a drizzly evening, curiosity tugging at me. The soft glow from the lanterns combined with the classical music in the background created a cozy yet ominous atmosphere. I chose a corner table, sat down, and took in my surroundings. There was something special in the air, as if something was waiting, hidden beneath the serene appearance of the restaurant. As I was ordering, I overheard two employees talking about the basement. They spoke in hushed tones, as if mentioning it might bring about something unfortunate. They spoke of whispers in the night and shadowy figures that some of the staff had seen when staying late to clean up. My curiosity grew, and when one of the employees approached my table, I asked him about the basement. He looked taken aback, but after hesitating, whispered, "The basement is a place we rarely go to unless it's necessary. Everyone says there's something wrong down there, but if you really want to see it, I can unlock the door for you." I nodded, trying to keep a calm demeanor despite the chills creeping up my spine. The employee led me down a narrow hallway behind the bar to a heavy wooden door leading to the basement. He unlocked it, and the beam of his flashlight illuminated the dark stairs descending into the pitch black below. I stepped down, each stair seeming to lead me deeper into another world. The air grew colder, damp, and smelled of mildew. At the bottom, I found myself in a vast, dark cellar lined with old wine racks. I turned on my flashlight, casting a beam across the room, and immediately felt a strange sensation, as if someone was watching me from within the shadows. I walked further in, my flashlight sweeping over the dusty, cobweb-covered bottles, but everything seemed ordinary at first. However, as I neared the far end of the cellar, I heard faint footsteps, as if someone was quietly creeping behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. My heart pounded, and it felt like each breath I took echoed in the eerie silence. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that it was just my own footsteps echoing back. But then, a soft whisper echoed from somewhere in the darkness. It was a gentle, sorrowful voice. "Please, don't leave me here." I froze, a chill running down my spine. "Is someone here?" I called out softly, my voice reverberating in the silence. There was no answer, only the steady sound of rain from above sounding like a distant, mournful song. But then, from behind one of the wine racks, I saw a faint figure. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her long hair flowing down, her eyes hollow and filled with despair. She looked at me, saying nothing, just standing there silently in the darkness as if pleading for help. I didn't know what to do, but an inexplicable urge pushed me to step closer. As I moved toward her, the figure vanished, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the cellar. A whisper echoed again, like a sorrowful plea. "Please, don't leave me here." My heart tightened, feeling the pain and loneliness of this spirit. Perhaps she had once worked or lived in this cellar, but for some reason had become trapped here, unable to move on. I spoke, trying to reassure her, "I won't leave you." "What do you need me to do to help you?" There was no response, just the heavy silence surrounding me. Then, from a distance, I noticed a small wooden door hidden behind one of the wine racks. Guided by an invisible force, I walked over and opened the door. Behind it was a small, dark, and cold room with a few old, dusty items. In the corner, I saw an old notebook lying on a table. I picked it up, flipping through the pages to find scribbled entries in a woman's handwriting. She wrote about her lonely life in the cellar, her fear of being abandoned, and the man she once loved. The notebook ended with a hurried note. "If anyone finds this notebook, please remember me and help me find peace." I realized this was her final message. Her spirit couldn't leave because no one had remembered or acknowledged her. With compassion, I placed the notebook down, closed my eyes, and offered a quiet prayer for her to find peace. When I opened my eyes, the cellar seemed lighter, gentler, more serene. The woman's figure no longer appeared, and the cold, oppressive air faded. I sensed that her presence had finally left, as though her soul had found release. As I left the cellar, I felt a newfound calm. Though it was just a small prayer and a brief remembrance, I hoped it was enough to help her find rest. Since then, I've held the story of the woman in the cellar close to my heart, as a reminder that sometimes all a soul needs is to be remembered, so they can leave behind painful memories and find eternal peace. Continuing my journey into the unknown, I had learned about an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of the city. This hospital had once been the largest treatment facility in the area, but a massive fire in the 1980s had left it in ruins, forever deserted. Locals whispered of the spirit of a night watchman, the only casualty of the fire, who still lingered, guarding the secrets buried within the hospital's walls. That night, armed with a flashlight and unquenchable curiosity, I stepped onto the grounds of the hospital. The place was hauntingly beautiful, with decay claiming every corner, ivy creeping up the walls, shattered windows, and the eerie quiet of a forgotten world. From the moment I entered, a heavy feeling seemed to settle over me, blanketing the entire space. As I walked down the hospital's long, dark corridors, my flashlight cast brief glimpses on peeling doors, rusted iron beds, and decayed medical equipment. Everything felt as though it had been left in a hurry, as if this place had been the site of deep pain and despair. When I reached a hallway that had once held the staff offices, I heard soft footsteps echoing from the far end. At first, I thought it might be the echo of my own steps, but as the sound grew closer, I realized that someone, or something, was approaching. My heart raced, and then, in the dim light at the end of the hallway, I saw the faint figure of a man. He wore an old night watchman's uniform, his eyes hollow, his face etched with exhaustion. He stared directly at me, and for a moment I felt trapped by his gaze, unable to move. He began walking slowly toward me, each footstep echoing in the dead silence. I wanted to speak, to ask him who he was, but my throat felt frozen. As he approached, he stopped just a short distance away, his expression empty, his eyes strange and unblinking. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice soft yet commanding. "This place is not meant for the living." I tried to calm myself, mustering the courage to ask, "Are you the night watchman here?" The man nodded, his gaze never leaving me. "I was the last one here when this hospital fell to flames, and I am the only one left to guard its secrets." Curiosity grew within me. Secrets? Did something happen here? The watchman looked into the distance, as if reliving painful memories. Patients who were never healed. Surgeries that never concluded. Those who suffered and were abandoned here. His voice carried a haunting tone, filled with regret and sorrow. This hospital wasn't only a place for healing. It was a place that concealed dark secrets, where no one should ever return. A chill spread through me as I realized this wasn't just a hospital. It was a repository of pain, of souls unable to find peace. The darkness in this old hospital wasn't only from time and neglect, but also from the secrets this watchman had dedicated himself to guarding. He looked at me, his eyes issuing a silent warning. "I am trapped here to prevent anyone from uncovering the hospital's horrors. These secrets must remain buried forever." I nodded, feeling the weight and sorrow he bore. "I understand, but is there any way to help you leave this place, to find peace?" The watchman shook his head, his voice growing faint, each word heavy with resignation. "As long as there are those who seek to uncover this place, I will remain. It is my fate, and I have accepted it." He paused, then spoke again, his tone filled with quiet sorrow. "But if you can promise me that you'll never return, and that you'll let this place rest in peace, perhaps I can finally be at rest." I understood that this was the only way his spirit could find peace. "I promise," I whispered, feeling the weight of empathy and sadness for him. The watchman nodded, his gaze becoming softer, more at ease. Gradually his figure faded, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. The space around me grew peaceful, yet it left an indelible sadness. As I left the hospital, I carried his promise in the memory of that watchman, a spirit bound to guard the secrets and pain of those who had been forsaken there. And I knew I would never return, so he might finally rest in peace. The woman on the stairs looked at me, her expression vacant, yet filled with an overwhelming sadness. She stood motionless, her black gown flowing like shadows around her, as if she were suspended in time, waiting for something, or someone, that would never come. I took a steadying breath, reminding myself that I'd encountered restless spirits before, but there was something uniquely haunting about her gaze, as if it carried an unspoken plea for help. "Who are you?" I called out, knowing she might not respond. The air seemed to grow even colder, and for a moment, I thought I saw her lips move, forming silent words that I couldn't hear. Then, in a voice as soft as the wind rustling through leaves, she finally spoke. "I am the one who was forsaken, left behind in this castle to wait, bound by a curse I cannot break." Her voice was filled with sorrow, each word carrying the weight of centuries. "They took everything from me, my life, my love, my future, and now I linger here, trapped, unable to leave." Her gaze shifted to the window as if lost in memories, her expression growing even more distant. I felt a pang of empathy, a deep sadness for this woman who seemed condemned to an eternity of waiting. "Is there any way to free you from this curse?" I asked gently. She looked back at me, a glimmer of hope flickering in her otherwise lifeless eyes. "The curse can only be broken if someone truly remembers me and understands my pain. If they know my story and carry it beyond these castle walls, only then can I be freed." I nodded, silently vowing to honor her request, to remember her story so that she might finally find peace. Her figure began to fade, blending into the shadows of the castle. Her parting words echoed faintly. "Thank you. Please don't let my memory fade." As she disappeared, the room felt warmer, less oppressive, as if her presence had finally lifted. Leaving the castle, I carried her story with me, a reminder of those who are bound to the past, waiting to be remembered so they might one day be free. The woman said nothing, simply standing there, watching me for a long moment. Then she turned and walked into a room upstairs, leaving the door slightly ajar. An inexplicable urge compelled me to follow her, as if this was a mission I was meant to fulfill. I ascended the staircase, stepping carefully as each creak of the wooden boards echoed in the silent hall. Reaching the room she had entered, I found it to be an old, elegant bedroom, filled with the remnants of a long-forgotten time. Dust blanketed the furniture, and a large bed with deep crimson curtains hung loosely around it. She stood by the window, gazing outside, as if waiting for someone. After a moment, she turned, and I could see the sorrow and longing in her eyes. Her voice, soft and ghostly, filled the air. "You shouldn't be here. This place carries a curse that no one can break." Unable to resist my curiosity, I asked, "What curse? Why are you here, trapped like this?" She looked at me, her eyes heavy with memories, her lips parting as if recalling a story buried deep within. "I was once the mistress of this castle. On my wedding day, I was betrayed by the one I loved most. That pain turned into a curse I could never break, and my soul has been imprisoned here ever since, bound by loneliness and sorrow." She paused, her voice growing softer. "He swore he would return to redeem his wrongs, but that vow was never kept. And so I remain, waiting for him to fulfill his promise. But to this day, I am still alone." A deep sympathy stirred within me. Her curse wasn't merely one of being bound to this place, but was also a broken promise that had never been fulfilled. She had devoted her life, and her soul, to waiting for someone who had abandoned her. Is there a way to set you free? I asked, though I feared the answer might be a sorrowful silence. The woman closed her eyes, as if lost in thought. If someone could forgive him, and promise me that I will no longer have to wait, perhaps I could finally depart. I stood there, taking a deep breath, and replied, I promise to forgive him, even though I do not know him. I will end this waiting on your behalf so you may find peace. She looked at me, her eyes filled with gratitude and a glimmer of hope. A single tear traced down her cheek, and in that moment she seemed younger, free from the sadness that had weighed her down. Her form began to fade, her gaze serene and content at last. As she disappeared completely, a gentle breeze seemed to pass through the room. The space brightened, the oppressive weight in the air lifting. I knew then that she had been released, that she had finally left this place with a tranquil soul, freed from the curse of her past. As I left the castle, I looked back at it, now bathed in the soft light of dawn. The curse was broken, and I hoped she had found the peace she so deserved. Though I never knew her name, I would always remember the woman in the castle who had waited for so many years, until she was finally released from her endless waiting. And from that day, I believed that sometimes, promises kept and forgiveness given are all a soul needs to find rest. After my harrowing and sorrowful experiences with trapped souls, I thought I had grown strong enough to face other mysterious stories. One night, when the city was quiet and the streets were deserted, I decided to take the last subway of the day. I wanted to challenge myself, to see if I could sense any supernatural presence in a place so bustling yet so shadowed. Stepping into the subway car, I noticed it was nearly empty, with only a few people scattered across the seats. The sound of the wheels rolling over the tracks mixed with the cold wind slipping through the windows, creating a somber, chilling atmosphere. As the train started moving and entered the dark tunnels, the dim lighting inside made me feel as though I were entering another world. At first, everything seemed normal. I sat down on an empty seat near the door, my eyes following the scenery rushing past outside the window. But after just a few minutes, I began to feel something strange. The car grew eerily quiet, silent enough that I could hear my own breathing. Then, a creeping sense of unease settled in, as though I were no longer alone. I looked up and noticed that the people around me seemed off. A woman sat in the distance, her hollow eyes staring blankly into space. A thin man stood by the door, his face as expressionless as if it were carved from stone. And a small child sat by the window, clutching an old doll tightly, her wide eyes fixed directly on me. A feeling of dread rose within me. I turned, intending to leave, but the doors had locked shut, and the train continued speeding through the dark tunnel. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm, convincing myself that this was just my imagination, fueled by fatigue. At that moment, a faint whisper sounded behind me. I turned around, but there was no one nearby. I closed my eyes, trying to focus and not let fear take hold. But when I opened them, I realized I was no longer sitting in the subway car as I had been before. Everything around me had changed. The car was now packed with people, all sitting in silence, their faces pale and their hollow eyes staring forward. As I took it all in, the train car suddenly brightened, and these ghostly figures began to fade, leaving behind an empty, silent space. When the train stopped at the next station, I stood up and stepped off, my heart weighed down but filled with a strange sense of purpose. I walked along the deserted platform, turning back to look at the car one last time. In the dim light, I caught sight of the woman sitting silently, her eyes reflecting a hint of peace and gratitude. That night, I couldn't shake the memory of her gaze or the whisper in my mind, "Remember us." And since then, whenever I hear the sound of wheels rolling along the tracks, I think of those spirits, still traveling an endless journey, waiting for someone to remember them and help them find peace. The lights in the subway car flickered, and at that moment, I heard a weak, sorrowful voice beside me. "I once rode here. and I never left. Startled, I looked over at the woman. She appeared pale and ghostly, as if she were merely a shadow. I didn't know what to say. All I could do was sit there, feeling a chill run down my spine. The woman continued to whisper, her voice like an echo from some distant place. "We all once rode here, but none of us ever left. We're trapped. Forever." I glanced around and realized that everyone else in the car was looking at me. Their gazes were cold, empty, as if they were no longer human, just wandering shadows devoid of life. Suddenly, the train's whistle blew and the car shuddered violently, as if traveling over a rough track. The space around me blurred, and I could no longer distinguish reality from illusion. The figures around me seemed to dissolve into thin air, yet their eyes remained fixed on me, each gaze filled with desperation and a yearning for freedom. The whispers grew louder, echoing in my mind like a haunting refrain. "Don't leave. Don't forget us. Remember us." A deep sadness and an unnameable regret filled my heart. I realized these were the souls of those who had perished on nighttime trains, perhaps due to accidents, perhaps due to unknown mysteries. They were trapped here, on a journey with no final destination, existing only as lingering shadows. With a feeling of compassion, I whispered, "I won't forget you. I'll share your story so no one will have to suffer in loneliness and be forgotten forever." After encountering countless haunting stories within the city, I decided to escape the bustling streets and seek solace in a quieter place. In the outskirts, I'd heard whispers about an old abandoned amusement park. They said that on rainy nights, the Ferris wheel would start spinning on its own, despite no one being there to control it. Intrigued by the possibility of lingering spirits, I felt compelled to explore. That evening, I arrived at the park just as the rain began to fall, steady and persistent. The rain wasn't heavy, but it draped the surroundings in a cold, damp gloom. The park lay nestled within a small forest, shrouded in darkness and silence. Tall grass grew wild along the pathways, and the rides were rusted relics of a once joyous past. I walked along the narrow path leading to the heart of the park, where the Ferris wheel loomed silently in the shadows. Each seat looked weathered and decayed, the chains creaking as the wind passed through. The entire place felt eerie, as if I were stepping into a forgotten world. As I neared the Ferris wheel, a soft, distant laughter drifted out from the darkness. It was faint, the laughter of children at play, yet it held an unsettling chill. I looked around but saw nothing, only darkness and the steady patter of rain. Suddenly, the Ferris wheel began to move, slowly turning despite no one being there to operate it. The seats creaked and groaned as they circled in the dark, filling the air with a disconcerting sound. It was as if someone, or something, was riding those seats, playing in their own hidden world. I took a few steps back, trying to stay calm, but an unshakable sense of unease crept over me. Then, from the shadows, a faint figure appeared on one of the seats. It was a young girl, with long hair whipping in the wind, wearing a tattered, dirty white dress. She sat on the Ferris wheel, her dark eyes fixed on me. In the dim light, her gaze held a deep sadness and profound loneliness. Unable to hold back, I asked softly, "Who are you? Why are you here all alone?" The little girl didn't answer, just looked at me with those haunting, hollow eyes. Then, in a soft, ghostly voice, she whispered, "We used to play here, laugh together, but then everyone left, and it was just us who stayed behind." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I began to understand that this was a place where children had once laughed and played, but for some reason, they'd been left behind, unable to move on. The spirit of this little girl, and perhaps many others, were trapped here, lingering in memories of happier times. "Do you want to leave this place?" I asked, feeling a pang of sorrow. The girl shook her head, her eyes growing even sadder. "We can't leave. This Ferris wheel is the last place we felt joy. But then everything was abandoned, and we were forgotten here, with no one to remember us." I felt my heart ache for these lost spirits. I stepped closer to the Ferris wheel, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch one of the old worn seats. In that moment, faint laughter echoed around me, as if invisible children were gathering, filling the air with the energy of days long gone. I closed my eyes, my heart filled with emotion. In that moment, I made a promise. I will remember you. I won't let you be forgotten. When I opened my eyes, the girl and the faint sounds of laughter had faded away, leaving only the rain softly hitting the ground. The Ferris wheel came to a slow halt, and the air around me grew still and quiet once more. As I left the park, I carried with me the image of the girl's empty gaze and the laughter of those unseen children. That night, I couldn't sleep, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that Ferris wheel, the seats swaying in the night, bearing the memories of little souls who would never return. And from that night on, I knew that in every abandoned park, in every place that once held joy, perhaps there are souls of children who once found happiness there. And I would never forget my promise to remember them so that they wouldn't be lost in darkness and oblivion forever. After a string of experiences with the supernatural, I had begun to accept the presence of spirits and the stories they left behind. But one rainy night, I received a mysterious call from someone I never thought I'd hear from again, a dear friend who had passed away many years before. The rain pattered against my window, making the room feel even darker and more somber. I was reading a book when my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Normally I wouldn't answer, but a strange feeling urged me to pick up. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. There was a pause on the other end, and then a faint, sorrowful voice said, "It's me, Jack." I froze, my heart pounding. Jack had been my closest friend since high school. He'd passed away nearly a decade ago in a car accident. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but that voice, it was unmistakably his. "Jack, is it really you?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "Yes, it's me," he replied. "I need your help, my friend. You have to return to the last place we went together. I'm trapped there. I can't leave." The last place we had gone together was a remote spot on the outskirts, a quiet hill with an old wooden bridge spanning a small stream. It was where we used to sit, watch the sunset, and share our dreams for the future. But after Jack's death, everything changed, and I had never been back there since. "Why are you stuck there?" I asked, struggling to understand. "I don't know," Jack whispered, his voice heavy with fatigue and pain. "Every night I find myself back there reliving that accident over and over. But no one hears me, no one sees me. I need you to come, to help me find a way to move on." Then Jack hung up, leaving me in a state of shock mixed with a strange, undeniable urgency. I knew I had to go back to that place, to uncover what had happened to Jack, and, if possible, help him find peace. The following morning, I drove out toward the outskirts, following the familiar road through the forest. The scenery around me brought back countless memories of days spent with Jack, our endless laughter filling the air. But as I approached the old bridge, a chilling sadness settled over me. The bridge looked weathered, its wooden planks decayed and creaking beneath my feet. Standing in the middle, I looked down at the quiet stream below, its gentle flow like silent tears that had run for years. "Jack, are you here?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. There was no response, but suddenly, a cold breeze swept through, making me shiver. I glanced around, feeling uneasy, and then, across the bridge, a faint image appeared. It was Jack, looking just as he had on that last day we met, wearing his old jacket, his eyes bright but weary. "Thanks for coming, my friend," Jack whispered, gratitude in his eyes. "Jack, why are you stuck here? What happened?" I asked, feeling a surge of sadness and regret. Jack gazed at me, his eyes filled with sorrow. "That night, I drove across this bridge in a hurry, in the dark, never imagining it would be the last thing I'd see. I can't accept that everything ended so suddenly. So I stay here, reliving that moment over and over, unable to move on. Fighting my own emotions, I ask, "Is there anything I can do to help you, Jack?" Jack was silent for a moment. Then he softly replied, "I need a promise. Promise me that you'll live a full life, that you'll achieve the dreams we once shared, and remember me so I can find peace." My heart tightened, but I knew it was the only way I could help him. "I promise, Jack. I'll live for both of us, and I'll never forget you." Jack smiled, a faint, grateful smile. His image slowly faded into the wind, and I felt a calmness settle over the space around me, as though Jack's spirit had finally found release. I stood there on the bridge, looking out over the distance, feeling lighter than ever. I never received another call from Jack after that day, but I knew he had found peace, no longer trapped in those painful memories. And from that day on, whenever my phone buzzed, I remembered Jack, my friend who had left too soon, and the promise I would always keep, to live a meaningful life, one that would honor his memory. After the harrowing and emotional encounters with forgotten spirits, I thought I'd steeled myself enough to face any eerie tale. But one night, I heard a story about an old house hidden deep within a forest north of the city, a place that locals claimed echoed with the haunting sound of a piano on rainy nights, despite being abandoned for decades. My curiosity was piqued once more, and I set out to uncover the mystery lurking within. The house was hidden under a canopy of dense trees, with moss-covered brick walls, a partially collapsed roof, and shattered window panes. As I approached, a chill ran down my spine, the air heavy with an unsettling stillness. Rain began to fall, drops tapping on broken glass and decaying wood, as though nature itself was echoing my sense of foreboding. Stepping inside, I was greeted by the damp, musty scent of decay, the air thick with the weight of time and neglect. The darkness was nearly complete, broken only by the beam of my flashlight. Crumbling walls, dilapidated furniture cloaked in dust, and cobwebs draping from every corner met my gaze. Each step creaked beneath me, as if the house was warning me of its presence. As I ventured further, a faint melody began to drift down the hallway, a melancholic piano tune, each note weighted with sorrow and loss, filling me with a strange heaviness. I paused, listening, and felt as though the music was telling a story, a tragic tale of love and regret. Drawn by the sound, I followed the hallway into a large room at the end of the house. The door stood slightly ajar, and within a grand piano sat alone in the center of the room. In front of it, a shadowy figure was seated, his fingers dancing delicately over the keys as his gaze remained distant, seemingly unaware of my presence. I stood still, almost afraid to move, simply observing. The man had long silver hair, his face pale and etched with sorrow. His eyes were fixed on the piano, as though music was his only release from an unspoken grief. Finally, summoning my courage, I spoke. "Who are you? Why are you here alone?" Without stopping his playing, the man's voice, soft and sorrowful, drifted through the air like a gentle breeze. "I am a musician. I once lived and created here, but everything fell apart, and now I remain with only my music." I could feel the anguish in every word he uttered, as if he was sharing the story of a life shattered. "Why haven't you left? What keeps you here?" I asked. The man's hands paused on the keys, his gaze becoming even more distant. "When I was alive, this house was my sanctuary, where I poured my soul into music. But the one I loved left me, and my heart was broken. I waited for her to return, to play this final piece for her, but she never came back." I could see the pain etched in his face, and I understood that it was this unfulfilled love and lingering regret that bound him to the house, preventing him from moving on. "Is there anything I can do to help?" I asked, feeling a deep sympathy for this lonely soul. The man looked at me, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Listen to my music. Help me carry it to the world beyond, so that I may finally find peace." I nodded, standing silently as I listened to the final notes of his composition. Every note carried the weight of his soul, a soul trapped in the chains of the past, yearning for release. The melody held a profound sadness, a testament to his devotion and his heartbreak. When the music faded, the man smiled, a serene, grateful smile. Slowly, his figure began to dissolve into the mist, leaving me alone in the empty room with the silent piano. The air was now thick with a strange stillness, as if the house itself was acknowledging the release of his spirit. I left the old house, carrying his sorrowful melody within me, vowing to share his story and his music with the world. And from that day forward, whenever I heard the sound of a piano on a rainy night, I thought of that lonely musician who dedicated his life and soul to music and bore the sorrow of a love that could never be fulfilled. After encountering so many forgotten souls, I thought I'd come to understand the spirit world, but there was still a force that compelled me to search for answers beyond explanation. On a short trip to the northern mountains, I heard about a forest nestled deep in a valley. Locals whispered of a spirit that roamed within, appearing whenever the fog blanketed the trees. This spirit was said to follow anyone who dared enter, as if searching for something or someone long lost. One cold, misty morning, with a thick fog obscuring the path, I decided to explore. As I stepped into the forest, an intense chill wrapped around me, as if each step was leading me further into another world. Tall trees with thick canopies created deep shadows, blocking out the sun almost entirely. Everything was silent, with only the rustling leaves in the wind and the soft crunch of my own footsteps echoing through the stillness. The further I went, the thicker the fog grew, and soon the landscape became a blur. I could hardly see the path ahead, and every time I turned around, I felt a strange sense that someone was standing just beyond the mist, silently watching me. Suddenly, I heard light footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just the echo of my own steps, but when I stopped walking, the sound stopped too. And when I started moving again, the footsteps resumed, steady and soft, as if someone were keeping just enough distance to avoid being seen. My heart began to race, yet my curiosity kept me from leaving. I turned around, but the thick fog concealed everything, save for the faint outlines of the trees. The footsteps continued, a haunting rhythm in the gloomy air, mirroring my own as I moved forward and ceasing whenever I paused. Eventually, I couldn't bear the eerie silence any longer and called out, "Is someone there?" No one answered. Only the whispering wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the strange murmurs of the forest. But in that moment of quiet, I felt the undeniable presence of someone else. Through the fog, a faint figure appeared, a tall, slender woman standing silently among the trees. She wore a long cloak, her dark hair cascading down, partially obscuring her face. From afar, her gaze met mine, filled with a sorrow so profound it was almost tangible. She stood as still as a statue, like she had been waiting for me for a very long time. "Who are you?" I asked, struggling to keep calm despite the chill of fear creeping over me. The woman slowly raised her hand, pointing further into the forest where the fog thickened even more, obscuring everything. Her voice was soft like a breeze, yet clear enough to reach me. "Follow me." Despite the dread gnawing at me, my curiosity was stronger. I followed her through narrow, winding paths, the fog closing in as though it intended to swallow us both whole. Her figure drifted ahead like a wisp of smoke, silent, with only the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. Eventually we reached a clearing in the forest, where a small pond lay encircled by moss-covered rocks. She stopped at the water's edge, her gaze fixed on the still surface. In a gentle motion, she knelt down by the pond, her slender fingers brushing lightly across the water, causing delicate ripples to fan out.
I stood beside her, not daring to speak. Her eyes remained fixed on the water, as if searching for something precious that had been lost long ago. "What are you looking for?" I asked, my voice barely cutting through the eerie silence. She turned to look at me, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Long ago, I waited here for someone. We promised to meet by this pond, to stay together forever. But he never came. And I kept waiting for so long that my soul couldn't leave this place." I was struck by the weight of her words. She was trapped in this forest, endlessly waiting for someone who would never return, bound by a promise that was never fulfilled. "Is there anything I can do to help?" I asked, feeling a deep sadness for her. She was silent for a moment before she softly replied, "If you could lead me out of this forest, perhaps I could finally find peace." I nodded, agreeing to guide her out of the woods. She stood, and together we walked back through the forest paths. But this time, an unusual stillness surrounded us, as though the forest itself was watching her journey to freedom. When we reached the forest's edge, I turned back to look at her, but she was already gone, vanished, as if she had merged into the very air, or perhaps she had finally found her release. The fog gradually lifted, and I knew that her spirit had found rest, freed from the eternal waiting. That night, I left the forest with a light heart, carrying the image of a woman waiting by a pond. And once again I realized that this world is full of forgotten souls, needing just a little help to find peace at last.
One winter day, wandering through an isolated countryside outside the city, I happened upon a tale about an abandoned village, hidden deep within the woods, known by few. This village, once home to strange inhabitants, was shrouded in mystery. In the village stood a peculiar house called the House of Mirrors. Legend had it that anyone who entered this house felt as if they'd stumbled into another world, surrounded by haunting reflections and ghostly figures emanating from countless old mirrors hung all around. Drawn by the eerie tale, I decided to visit this forsaken village myself. Entering the village, a heavy atmosphere enveloped me. Crumbling houses, their walls overgrown with moss, stood as silent witnesses of a forgotten past. At the far end of the village, I found the House of Mirrors, a solitary structure, still standing as though awaiting new visitors. It was an ancient building, its tiled roof covered in moss, and its wooden doors worn with age. Peering through a dusty window, I could see faint glimmers bouncing off the mirrors inside, like soulless eyes peering back. Summoning my courage, I entered, and a cold chill engulfed me. Inside, everything was neatly arranged, yet covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs hanging from every corner. Mirrors were everywhere, on the walls, the floor, even suspended from the ceiling and hung on the doors. There were large mirrors that took up entire walls and small ones barely big enough to reflect half a face. Each one was old, cracked, creating distorted, eerie reflections. I moved from room to room, the creaking floorboards protesting under each step. It felt as though hundreds of unseen eyes followed my every movement. In each mirror, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't quite me. The eyes staring back were cloudy, as if someone else's spirit lurked behind the glass. Then, something strange happened. In a large mirror hanging in the center of the living room, my reflection seemed to move, even though I was standing still. My image in the mirror stared back with a twisted, eerie smile. My heart pounded as I took a step back, but the reflection continued watching me, its eyes deep and shadowed, as if trying to convey a message. "Do you want to know our story?" A voice whispered, soft yet chilling, seemingly from somewhere within the room. I turned, but no one was there, only my reflection in the mirror, still gazing at me with hollow eyes. "We once lived here," the voice continued, closer now, as if coming from within the mirror itself. "We had dreams, lives, but we were forgotten, and now our souls are trapped here forever." In that moment I realized the reflections in the mirrors weren't mine, but belonged to the people who had once inhabited this house. They were trapped in the mirrors, unable to find peace, stuck in the forms they'd once had. These figures watched me, eyes filled with anguish, pleading for some form of help. Trying to keep calm, I listened as the whispers from the mirrors grew louder, blending into a haunting chorus that echoed through the house. We cannot leave. No one remembers us. We are forgotten, and this house has become our prison. A wave of sorrow washed over me. These were people who had once existed, who had lives, yet had been abandoned, becoming shadows that no one remembered. No one knew why they were trapped, only that this house had become their eternal cage. "Is there any way I can help you?" I asked softly, my heart aching for them. One figure in the mirror looked at me, eyes glimmering with a faint hope mixed with despair. "If someone remembers us, if someone tells our story, maybe we can find peace." I nodded, promising them that I would take their story beyond this village, that they would not remain forgotten. In that moment, the mirrors seemed to glow with an otherworldly light, and the reflections within them gradually faded, as though their souls were finally being released from their confinement. I left the house, my heart heavy, yet filled with hope. I knew that these forgotten souls had finally found peace. And from that day on, whenever I look into a mirror, I no longer see just my own reflection. Instead, I see those hollow eyes, reminders of the spirits once trapped, urging me to keep my promise and share their story with the world. On a winter day, while wandering through a quiet village on the outskirts of town, I stumbled upon an antique shop tucked away in a narrow alley. The shop had an old-fashioned charm, with the warm glow of oil lamps spilling out into the chilly air. Inside, every object seemed to hold a story of its own, each item exuding an aura of mystery from the decades it had witnessed. As I admired the various trinkets and relics, my attention was drawn to an item perched on the highest shelf. It was a small doll, dressed in a classic red dress, with black curly hair and glass eyes that seemed almost alive. Those eyes had a strange pull, making me feel as if someone were watching me intently through the polished glass. At first I felt a slight chill, but found myself unable to look away from the doll. The shopkeeper, a frail old man with a sorrowful expression, noticed my interest and approached me quietly. "There's something special about that doll, isn't there?" he asked. "Yes, it's her eyes. It feels like there's something hidden deep within them," I replied, still transfixed. The old man nodded slowly, his voice dropping to a hushed tone filled with a hint of mystery. "This doll once belonged to a little girl who passed away. They say her spirit clings to the doll, never able to leave it." I asked why the girl's spirit would remain so attached, but he only responded, "Loss and loneliness can anchor a soul, trapping it between two worlds. This doll is her only tether to the living." Captivated by his story, I decided to purchase the doll and take it home, even though a lingering unease weighed on me. From the very first night, strange things began to happen. As I lay in bed, I could have sworn I heard the faint giggle of a child echoing in the room. Opening my eyes, I saw the doll sitting on a chair near my bed, her glistening eyes fixed on me in the dark. Initially, I thought it was just my imagination, but over time, the eerie occurrences grew stronger. Items in the room shifted slightly from where I had left them. The clock would stop without explanation, and every night I'd hear soft footsteps coming from the doll's direction. One night, determined to understand, I placed the doll across the room, facing the window so I could observe her more closely. Gazing into those glassy eyes, I noticed something unsettling. What was reflected in the doll's eyes was not my room, but an entirely different space. An old room with peeling walls and dim, faded light. It was as if her eyes were a window to another world, a realm where the spirit of the girl was trapped. Curiosity overshadowed my fear, and I whispered, "What do you need? Why are you still here?" The doll's eyes seemed to shimmer, as if she had heard my question. A soft, childlike voice filled my mind, gentle yet laced with loneliness. I just want to go home. I want to be with my family again, but I can't. My heart clenched, feeling the isolation in her words. I realized that this doll was her only link to feeling connected to the world, her last anchor to a reality she couldn't leave. How can I help you? I asked, voice low and full of compassion. The voice spoke again, tinged with regret. If someone remembers me, if someone tells my story, maybe I can finally find peace. I understood then that my purpose was to share her story, to make sure she wouldn't be forgotten. I promised her that I would tell others, that people would know she had once lived, once had a family, once knew joy and sorrow. The next morning I returned to the antique shop to tell the old man about my experience. He nodded knowingly, as if he had been waiting for this moment, and said softly, "You've done the right thing. Because of your kindness, the girl's spirit can finally rest." As I left the shop, a sense of peace washed over me, and I no longer heard the laughter or the footsteps at night. The doll remained on the shelf, but her eyes had dulled, as though the spirit within had moved on, finally at peace. Through these encounters, I've come to believe that our world holds more than just the living. It shelters souls who linger, bearing unspoken pain and unresolved longing. They seek nothing more than understanding and empathy to help them find peace and depart from this world. These souls have lived, loved, suffered, and sometimes all they need is someone to hear their story so they no longer feel forgotten. And as these tales come to a close, I invite you to await the stories to come, stories that, one day, may find their way to you. Remember, sometimes, just a small act of compassion and understanding is all it takes to bring peace to both worlds.